So much, Erica.
Yeah.
Up next, we're going to be having Bethany McGowan from Purdue University. She has a project on the OSM mapping as a critical data literacy instruction tool. This is a Failfest session, and I'm also excited about this one because it's usually how we explain all the things that could potentially go wrong sometimes. And we can always learn a lot from this. So please take it along, Bethany.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Perfect.
All right, let me see if I can share my screen here. I don't see that I can share my screen, that I can share my slides.
I think the option should be enabled. If we could have our bank colleagues help us with that, but just a second. There we go.
Perfect. Thank you.
Hi, Bethany. Sorry, that's actually my screen. So if you can please give me prompts to move on to the next slide, I'll do that if that's okay.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm going to be speaking today on OSM mapping as a critical data literacy instruction tool. And I'll be talking specifically about how instructional standards helped me boost my Mapathon participation. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so I'm Bethany McGowan. I'm an assistant professor at Purdue University in the School of Information Studies. So my perspective from hosting Mapathons is distinctly based in higher education, working with both undergraduate and graduate students. Thank you. So I began hosting Mapathons in about 2017. My first Mapathon event was a collaboration with my university's GIS Day celebration. I thought it was a really, a great way to introduce students to GIS data and mapping and doing it as sort of a social good. So I got really interested about 3 years ago. After hosting about 5 or 6 Mapathons over 2017 and 2018, I started noting just a few challenges. First was dealing with recruitment because I wanted to recruit students from across the university, not just within the libraries and School of Information Studies. And so that just took a little bit of time. It took some time to sort of leverage collaborations and do the work required to recruit students for the events. I also noticed that my participation numbers were inconsistent. We had some Mapathons that were really well attended and others that weren't. So we would have one Mapathon for 1 month that might have 6 students, and then the next month would have like 60 students. And there was no real way to guess what those numbers would look like. And then finally, again, oh, can you go back? I'm sorry. The lack of learning objectives made it difficult for me to measure participant learning. So one of the things about sort of my life in academia is my job is to really be able to tell if my students are learning, what they're learning, and how successful activities are, even if they're just extracurricular. So I wanted to highlight the value of mapping, but I really wasn't doing it in the way I was approaching my Mapathon hosting. Okay, next slide. All right, so I started looking for answers, and the first thing that I did was started to survey my students. So I conducted a survey to just try to understand why students were really even attending the Mapathons. And I have that title of that study if you want to take a look at it. But I found that they were motivated by intrinsic and extrinsic factors. So they wanted to learn to manage data, for example. They were very interested in Mapathons when I sort of highlighted them as a way to learn to work with big data. But they were also interested in participating in work that supported a social good. So you see the sort of this mix of factors. And then I also applied Mapathon learning objectives and assessments that were guided by my findings around the motivation study, by active learning instruction pedagogies, and by the ACRL, the Association of College and Research Libraries, visual literacy competency standards for higher education. And I'll be talking about those a little bit here. Next slide. Okay, visual literacy. So visual literacy is a set of abilities that enables an individual to effectively find, interpret, evaluate, use, and create images and visual media. Visual literacy skills equip a learner to understand and analyze the contextual, cultural, ethical, aesthetic, intellectual, and technical components involved in the production and use of visual materials. A visual literate individual is both a critical consumer of visual media and a competent contributor to a body of shared knowledge and culture. So as soon as I saw this definition, I sort of immediately thought of the work that I was doing in hosting mapathons, and really sort of the work that HOT is doing in teaching mappers these skills. So they seem like a natural fit for the sort of competencies that I wanted to sort of show mapathons as teaching. Next slide. So I like these visual standards because they helped guide the design of learning objectives. I also created a few activities and assessments that really focused on teaching students to critically view and use map data and aerial satellite imagery to produce maps. The standards are accompanied by performance indicators and learning outcomes that made it easier for me to develop these learning objectives and activities. Next slide. Okay, maps can be used as evidence to formulate and support research. Was there a slide? Okay, yes. Mapping activities offer a learner-centered means to evaluate. Oh, okay, let's see here. Oh, okay, so yes, the slide here focuses on how mapping helps build critical data literacy skills. So what do I mean by that? So when I talk about critical data literacy, I'm really using maps and mapathons and OSM mapping to teach students to validate data sources, to teach them to observe and question data gathering methods, to question data quality, and to help improve spatial reasoning. So when I talk about critical data literacy, those are the specific skills that I am sort of talking about and teaching. Next slide. And then we use the maps as evidence to formulate and also support research questions. So even outside of mapping, if I'm not, necessarily hosting a mapathon, I still like to use the OSM maps because I find them really useful as a visual aid and as a visual evidence to support research questions. So I tend to work with health sciences students, and they, when they come up with their research questions, for example, for my public health students, a question might be, what can a map tell you about community health needs? So if you're doing a community health project, you might not immediately think to look to maps for visual and map data as support or evidence for community needs, but they can actually be a really useful and reliable source for information. So just encouraging students to think about incorporating maps as a form of evidence. Next slide. So learning objectives for mapathons can center on one or more competencies established for a visually literate individual in higher education, especially focusing on the ethical, legal, social, and economic issues surrounding the use and the creation of images and media. Next slide.
That's the last slide I have in that deck, sorry.
Oh, okay. Okay, so I guess I'll just talk. So that was sort of my end point. It was, let me see the slide that I have here. So my final points were that the application of instructional standards really helped boost my mapathon participation. So by sort of applying learning objectives, I was able to improve my recruitment strategy. So I still had to do the work of recruitment, but I just modified it a little bit because understanding the potential learning gains really allowed me to target specific audiences. For example, instead of trying to, go to every single potentially interested campus organization, I was really able to target sort of some of the data and how sciences centered learning communities with very specific sort of goals in around what students could learn if they participated in these events. I also started working with some of our data in the social sciences courses. And these collaborations really improved the consistency and participation numbers because I was working with specific groups. They could tell me roughly how many students would be involved, and those numbers were a lot more reliable than what I had been receiving. And then finally, the creation of learning objectives and assessments made it possible for me to measure participant learning and to really highlight the value of mapping as an extracurricular or co-curricular activity, which made it much easier for me to justify to my supervisors and superiors why I was spending so much time hosting these mapathons and trying to do the work there. And finally, while I found that the ACRL visual literacy competency standards worked well for me, these are fairly well known in my discipline, but there are probably alternatives. And I sort of am interested if anyone has any experience applying similar standards, maybe from different types of disciplines. Okay, that is my presentation. I'm happy to share some of my updated slides. There were just 2 slides missing, but I can share.
That was so interesting, Bethany. Thank you so much. We have a couple of minutes for questions, and there's already some of them on the chat. Okay. So I'll just read them for you very quickly. From Janet Chapman, she says, do you have any examples of how you are using maps for research inquiries and or curriculum? We want to develop resources to promote map literacy.
Yeah, I can actually share with the group, not right now, but I'll send it over later. One of my syllabuses from a course where I incorporate some mapping.
Perfect. We can drop those resources in the chat. From Mikkel, as an instructor, what was your and your students' experience of the broader OSM community, both good and bad?
So of the broader community, they were mostly good. I mean, some students did mapping as a one-time thing in my class or as an extracurricular thing that I was working on and then never revisited it. But I know that for a fact that some students were really invested in mapping and in joining the broader OSM community. One of the things that I liked about the sort of HOT and OpenStreetMap platform is that it sort of tracks the hours and the projects that you spend mapping. And so for my undergraduates, that was really helpful because they could take that data and add it to their resumes and sort of use that as evidence for future employers potentially that, I'm working on this big data project. And it just gave them something to work with as they were sort of beefing up their resume, and sort of the work around big data is trending now. So that was important to them. The bad is, I don't know if there's any bad about the OSM community. I can't think of anything right off the top, aside from that some students just weren't interested in it as a long-term investment.
That's very interesting. One last question from Claire. Are any of your mapathons instructions and learning objectives public so that could we also learn from them? I think you'll be sharing that in the chat, no?
I should have put them in the slides, but yeah, I'll definitely, that same syllabus that I mentioned does have the learning objectives for the course. So I'll get that out to everybody.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Bethany. Honestly, this is also very helpful for us. We're always looking to partner with many universities, and this is such a great framework to do it. I think you've done a great work with that.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, all right, everyone.